Go. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final Autonomous Vehicle Work Group Executive Committee meeting. I'm Jim Restucci, Commissioner with the Washington State Transportation Commission and your chair. Shiv, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Shiv Batra, Commissioner with Washington State Transportation Commission, and I pleasure to serve the vice chair.
Okay, and Markel, can you go ahead and do roll call, please?
Of course. Well, we'll start with you, Chair Stucci.
I am here.
Vice Chair Batra.
I'm here.
Senator Joe Nguyen. Senator Claudia Kaufman. Senator Curtis King. Senator Ann Rivers. Representative David Hackney. Representative Shelley Kloba.
Yes, here. Good morning.
Morning. Representative Mary Dye. Representative Leonard Christian.
Leonard Christian's here.
Scott McCoy representing for WSP.
Here.
David Fort representing for Office of Insurance Commissioner.
Here.
Marcus Glasper.
Hi, Markel. It's Bo. I'm here for Marcus Glasper.
Perfect. Thank you. Daniela Bremer representing WashDOT.
Good morning here.
Debbie Driver. Joel Sachs.
Hi, Allison Drake representing Joel Sachs.
Perfect. Thank you. Cami Feek.
I'm here.
Laura Johnson. Shelley Baldwin.
Here.
Zach Hudgens representing WATEC.
Here.
Dr. Yin Hai Wang. Justin Layton.
Present.
Bruce Agnew.
Here.
Armand Shabazian representing Seattle DOT.
Here.
Kurt Augustine.
Here.
Brenda Wiest. Todd O'Brien. Bob Pishu representing INRIX.
Here.
Milani McAleenan.
Melanie McLennan is here. Thank you.
Bryce Yaden. David Bonelli representing Ariel Wolf.
Here. Thank you.
Steve Gordon.
Here.
Annabelle Chang representing for Waymo.
Here.
Cecilia Black representing for Disability Rights Washington.
Here.
Chair Stucci, we have a quorum.
Thank you so much, Markel. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and move on to the second item on our agenda, which is a look back at the work group's journey. And Markel, you're up.
All right, well, good morning. Happy Thursday, everyone. We just wanted to take a few minutes at the beginning of this discussion today to look through all of the work that this work group has done since its inception back in 2018. So the very first meeting, June 27th, 2018, there were 16 executive committee members and 5 subcommittees established. And now at our last meeting, we have 35 executive committee members and 7 subcommittees. So we've grown a lot over the past 5 years to make sure that all perspectives have been brought to the table. A lot of accomplishments have been done, 25 total recommendations. 17 of those recommendations were endorsed and 8 have been acted upon either through legislation or administrative operational changes. Of those legislation, there are 4 that came to the table, 2 were enacted, 1 was superseded, and 1 had no further action during the legislative session this year. Through all of that culmination, there have been 13 total executive committee meetings, 95 subcommittee meetings across the 7 subcommittees. There have been joint subcommittees and a lot of agency collaboration with all of the involved agencies, industry partners, and the Transportation Commission. A ton of education and engagement, over 100 total presentations between public and private partners, from advocates, academia, industry, and government entities, including federal government, coming to speak with us and share insights over the years. And we just wanted to talk through, starting in 2018, the work group was established. We talked through how an idea becomes a law through this process, and then proved how that actually worked through all of the accomplishments that we just talked through, including adopting cooperative automated transportation policy goals and a policy framework, focus areas and priorities for this group to take on, begin driving towards the roadmap to the future legacy deliverable that we'll talk about a little later today. We discussed AV pilot considerations, approaches, and use cases, and actually had a recommendation come forward to carry out a state-sponsored AV pilot. Developed out that pilot approach and plan for further consideration, and now wrapping up, finalizing that roadmap to the future as the final effort of this work group, and giving to the Transportation Commission to really bring forward guidance for future decision-making in the AV policy space. So just a quick review. We'll talk a lot about a lot of these areas in the rest of the meeting, but just wanted to give a very large high five to everyone for all of the amazing work that you've done over the past 5 years. And that is it for that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Markel. And that goes to you too, well, at CDM Smith and WSP for all the work that you guys have done to assist the work group and the subcommittees. So appreciate that.
Of course.
Okay. Any questions or comments on this item? All right, moving on, we'll go to, actually, we're a little bit early. Do we have Andrew, Angela, and Michael available?
Yes. Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Great. Okay, so we will move on to item 3, which is the passenger services, autonomous vehicle, and digital policy. We have Andrew Glass Hastings, Executive Director of Open Mobility Foundation, Angela Giacchetti, I hope I got that right, Director of Partnerships and Development, Open Mobility Foundation, and Michael, I'm sorry, I'm probably going to mess up your name.
Schnerla.
Okay. Director of Open Source Operations, Open Mobility Foundation. So welcome, and let you have the floor.
Great, thank you. And should we go ahead and share? I saw our presentation there for a second. Should I go ahead and share it from my side?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
All right. Do that now. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Go slideshow. All right, is that up and displayed?
It is, yes.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity to present your final meeting here. Some work that we're doing at the Open Mobility Foundation that definitely is relevant to the autonomous vehicle conversation. I'd of course love to say you saved the best for last, but I won't be the ultimate judge of that. I'm Andrew Glass Hastings. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Mobility Foundation, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Angela Giacchetti and Michael Schnerla. And we're going to walk you through some information about the data standards and digital policy tools that our organization stewards on behalf of a public-private partnership that we work through. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in here, and I see quite a few familiar faces. I'm based here in Seattle and spent about a decade working for the city of Seattle for a couple of different Seattle mayors and the Department of Transportation. So very familiar with these this policy issues and considerations here in Washington State in particular. All right, so the Open Mobility Foundation, we are a global nonprofit public-private partnership that focuses on bringing cities and other public agencies, such as counties and MPOs, together with technology companies, mobility operators, to develop and steward open source data standards and tools that then public agencies use to manage shared mobility and the public space. So we're really focused on helping primarily public agencies work in collaboration with the private sector to develop these digital infrastructure tools to keep pace with the changing nature of transportation that we see before us. And so what does that mean? It means that we're really helping public agencies work with the private sector to go from this reality to this reality. And just going back real quick here, it's cities and agencies have been tasked with managing transportation, managing public space for decades, and have primarily been doing that through physical infrastructure, through the signage, the actual people, the traffic signals that we continue to experience and use and rely on every day. But more and more, over the past really 10 years here, we've been in the midst of this transformation of mobility on our streets. As transportation is becoming more and more digitized, we are living this reality on a daily basis. As we use our phones to get directions or pay for parking or find a shared scooter or electric bike or hail an Uber or Lyft, or now more recently, autonomous services like the Waymo that you see here on this slide. So the Open Mobility Foundation vision, kind of why we exist, we were formed by a group of cities in mid-2019. We are a city-founded and city-led organization. Our board of directors are made up of only city transportation executives. So we really do exist to serve that public interest. And we are helping develop digital infrastructure to help these agencies manage public space for the public good. And we do this in an open source and transparent manner. So the data standards that you'll hear about over the next few minutes here are always free and available for anyone to use. And we develop these tools through a very intentional public-private partnership or collaboration that really encourages a safe and flexible and transparent space for the technology companies and mobility operators to come together with the public agencies and align around the kind of vision and need for digital infrastructure going forward. We are, as I mentioned, a nonprofit open source foundation. Here is a sampling of the types of public agencies, both here in North America and globally, that are a part of our organization, as well as the private companies that are members and are working hand in hand with these public agencies on almost a daily basis to help develop these tools. Our open approach, which is really at the center of what we do, is developing technology built through this public and private sector collaboration. We work on a kind of a working group model. So similar to the conversations that you've been having over the past several years here, we host public virtual working group meetings on a monthly basis for these data standards that we develop and steward, so that anyone and everyone can participate in the development process as they go forward. We also use GitHub. And when I joined the Open Mobility Foundation just under a year and a half ago, I was GitHub fearful, I would say, and always thought of it as this really kind of code tech oriented tool. But as I've come to realize, it's an incredibly valuable resource for open source and transparent collaboration and development like we do at the Open Mobility Foundation. It is the kind of catch-all for the work that we do, from actually being able to offer contributions, provide comments or questions about the future development of the data standards, or just to find out the details of what these data standards are all about and how the organization, how our governance works, how our working group meetings work, when the next working group meeting is, for example. All of that can be found on our GitHub repository, and it's a publicly available resource. And so we're really focused on putting the mobility data specification and curb data specification right at the center of this collaboration between public agencies, software companies, and the mobility providers, who are all interested in aligning around the future kind of needs and use cases for these tools. But kind of at our core, we are focused on developing these open source standards as a source of standardized communication. You're going to hear more about this theme of standardizing the ability to communicate digitally between public agencies and the private mobility providers. And this comes to bear directly within this conversation of autonomous vehicle services and how we can foster collaboration between the agencies that are responsible for managing, planning, and regulating the public right-of-way and our streets, and the private mobility providers who are in the position of providing really important services for the public. All right, now with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Michael, who's going to spend a few minutes here talking more specifically about the tools that we are developing. Michael.
Thanks, Andrew. My name is Michael Schnerla. I work for the Open Mobility Foundation, been here about 4 years. The 4 years before this, I was with the city of Louisville, Kentucky, and then before that with many different technology companies. So I want to talk about our 2 data specifications. So first up is MDS, and we're on version 2 of this. We've had a lot of other minor versions before that. It goes back about 5 years. We have at least 180 cities in 25 countries using the mobility data specification. You can see a screenshot of GitHub, as Andrew mentioned, on the right, where it basically is, it reads more like a document of the blueprint for what MDS is that you can follow along for and build towards to allow this two-way communication between cities and companies. Because this is a standard that's open and widely used, there's an ecosystem of tools and vendors and software and hardware companies that have been developed products for cities and for mobility operators. But at its core, MDS helps manage shared vehicles in the public right-of-way. And you can see below a list of some of these: scooters, bike share, robo-taxis, regular taxis, TNCs, ride-hail, sidewalk delivery robots, and car share. Also a little bit of paratransit and some other sort of shared vehicles. Next slide. So this is a visual representation of MDS. You can see it down below. It's kind of a blueprint for a digital plumbing layer to allow the public agencies on the left to communicate 2 ways with companies and corporations on the right about the vehicles, like you see here, operating in the streets, on the sidewalks, in the public right-of-way. So the 2-way communication is what MDS allows and helps manage these vehicles. Next slide. So when we talk about 2-way, here's a little bit of a breakdown of that. So at the top there, you see data about vehicles coming from those vehicle operators, and that information is privately shared with the public agencies that are managing the right-of-way. So the cities and MPOs, and we even have some countries using MDS. They can get information about these vehicles. And then data about policy and rules of the right-of-way comes from public agencies to the agencies, and that is public. So that is it goes to the operator, sorry. That is public information. Anyone can use it. It's targeted towards the people operating vehicles in the right-of-way, but it sets out the boundaries for safe operation of those devices. Next slide. Privacy, of course, along all of this is of utmost concern to everybody involved. You can see a sort of funnel here of privacy from the left to the right of how MDS fits into that. So, vehicles and apps on the street like robo-taxis and scooters, they have a lot of information about the riders in the vehicle, trip data, financial data, things like that. The companies get data from those vehicles and those apps. They store that in their own servers and they manage those deployments. But MDS, when it comes to the city gets a subset of that vehicle and trip data. Nothing about riders or financial transaction data. And so it's really about the vehicles and what's happening with those vehicles in the right-of-way. And some cities choose to make aggregated versions of this data public through open data websites or different sunshine laws or reports that they create. And we have a number of privacy resources we've created that you can see here, and it's on our GitHub and our website as well.
Michael, I will add real quick before we move off this slide that it was very important for the Open Mobility Foundation to work with our community to ensure that that MDS complies with GDPR. And for those of you less familiar with GDPR, it's the data privacy policy laws in Europe. And so in order for MDS to spread to become a de facto standard for shared mobility in Europe, it needed to comply with GDPR, which we worked with European attorneys to ensure it does. So that's something that we are very proud of.
Yeah, and GDPR is really some of the strictest privacy guidance for data in the world. So yeah, and there's other initiatives in California and other places that are similar, but I think GDPR goes a little bit further. So the second data specification I want to talk about is the curb data specification. The next slide, Andrew. So this is a picture of this. Before we get to that, it's about a 2-year-old spec. We spent maybe a year and a half developing it with a lot of different people, a lot of different companies, 180 companies, I think 70 plus different organizations. And so what you see here is a visual representation of CDS. So what it allows is a government agency to define a curb space, a curb zone where activity can happen, and define where that is and what the rules are. And then the agency can monitor activity at the curb through different event tracking. And then those events can be turned into metrics, which then can be refined and help refine those policies and rules around those dynamic curb zones. And so this is more than coding the curb. It is about understanding activity at the curbs and making sense of it to improve policy across your jurisdiction. So let's dig into each of these. The first part of the curb data specification is what we call the curbs API. And this is really coding the curb. This is taking your either digital city asset data or physical signage at curb spaces and turning it into CDS format that anyone can use across any jurisdiction. If operators see this in one city, it's going to be the same in another city. And with this formatted CDS curb regulation data, from that, anybody, this is public, can make timetables of operational rules at the curbs. They can make maps like you see below. That's generated directly from the curb data specification. So you can define areas of interest and curb zones and parking spaces and rules all about your curbs. And it's a little bit larger than curbs. It can include, and it works with off-street parking. We focused on dynamic loading zones for commercial vehicles, which is probably of most interest to you on the call here. But it also can work with private vehicles at parking meters and other curb access scenarios. And then we have events. So this is the monitoring of activity at the curb, transactions at the curb. So, many agencies have lots of different ways to do this in some way already. Maybe they have parking meters, maybe they have a camera system, maybe they have pucks in the ground or sensors. CDS can support all of those types of events. And even if you have multiple different ways to track activity, CDS standardizes all of that into the same format so they can be cross-compared across your whole jurisdiction. And it includes something that most of these don't get now, which is information directly from the operator vehicle. So in that picture there, you can see a FedEx vehicle. If that curb zone is coded for a policy around delivery, FedEx, with the agreement with the city, can send a chunk of data over that says, we are about to use this curb zone. Okay, now we're in the curb zone. Here's what we're doing here. And now we're leaving the curb zone. So cities can get a lot of detailed event activity directly from the operators themselves. Next slide. And then all of those events and activities have a really concrete way to be turned into curb metrics. You can see some of these here, like total sessions, turnover, dwell time, and occupancy percent. And these metrics are also meant to be public. So once the city aggregates all of their curb usage from all the different operators across their jurisdiction, they can turn it into metrics using CDS and then publish those metrics for anyone who's using the curb to understand what happened historically in these areas and maybe prioritize and change their pickup and drop off locations their routes, their delivery times, things like that, using the metrics that a city is able to collect and publish using CDS. And real quick, who is using CDS? Well, after about 2 years, we've got at least 14 public agencies, 22 companies across 7 different countries using it. You can see some pictures and screenshots of the usage of where CDS is actively being used here, with which some of the companies involved. So you can see Omaha and Esri there, or in Dublin or Seattle, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia with the Pebble Puck. So very wide adoption pretty quickly relative to MDS, and we see it grow all the time. I don't think we have a slide on the SMART grant, US DOT SMART grant process, but 8 cities applied collaboratively to the US DOT SMART grant program, and they all got grants using CDS, framed around CDS. So we will take learnings from those programs as well, and improve CDS in the future. Yes. Hand is raised. But
Yeah,
we
I
have
have a quick
yep, we have a
question.
Representative Kloba.
Thank you, Jim. So this sounds like a great tool for cities. Have you been able to get any understanding of, from when they first deploy it through, currently, have they seen differences in how more efficiently their curb is being used, or any metrics like that a city is able to figure out, the cost benefit ratio for them?
Adria, Angela, do you want to answer that? I have some maybe less concrete examples. Maybe you'll have some. I know there are some.
One response that I would give right off the bat is, as Michael mentioned, this Smart Grant Collaborative is a group of cities like Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and LA and Miami and Philadelphia and others, major cities that are just now starting this journey of digitizing their curb rules and regulations within the CDS format. So we expect to have much stronger, kind of proof points to look at as the cities work through their federally funded projects to do this curb digitization work. The examples that Michael showed you a moment ago, for example, in Pittsburgh, where they've worked to create smart loading zones, actually designated loading zones within their center city that are only available to those operators who sign up for a permit and agree to provide their vehicle kind of license plate numbers to the system, so that the use of these smart loading zones can be monitored. So the system knows whether that user is authorized or not. And they've even taken the additional step of tying some climate goals that they have to incentivize delivery operators to move to low or zero emission vehicles by giving differential rates, so lower rates to the lower zero emission vehicles themselves. So that's not necessarily a good sort of compare against previous efficiencies to the new efficiencies. It's actually a new program designating space, and they know that these designated spaces, as they're able to see the events and the metrics that are coming off of those, they know how the kind of the level of efficiency that they're seeing in the use of those spaces, and the like I mentioned, the tie to some of the other policy objectives that they're seeing. I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but it's one approach.
I did find one example. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say that's helpful. Go ahead, Michael, if you have another example.
Yeah, the example I was thinking of, which I just found some information on, is from Pittsburgh. They've been running it, maybe one of the first cities to launch with CDS. So the data they've gathered in their pilot program so far for 47 different smart loading zones that use CDS indicated that people who use it, 55% of the people who park in those zones park for less than 15 minutes, which is a higher turnover rate than they had before. So they're able to make that curb use a lot more productive. And then less than 5% of those zones have people staying there for 1 or 2 hours or more. So I think you're seeing a lot better turnover and management of the curb, which means it's more productive.
Yeah.
And the revenue they've generated so far is about, just from this pilot, is $380,000 per year. So about 8,500 for each zone. And that's just with the pilot. So they feel like that's going to increase as well.
One of the things that I would mention, and the kind of the direct relationship of digital management of the curb to autonomous vehicles, of course, is the need for computer-driven cars, especially within the robotaxi realm, to have easy and safe access to the curb in order to facilitate safe pickup and drop-offs. And this is an area that we believe is sort of CDS and cities coding their curbs, enabling in a digital machine readable way so that any robotaxi system can tap into that data coming, or I guess the curb designations, for example, and then can work with cities to be able to create designated loading zones, perhaps for autonomous vehicles, or reservation systems, or just have the data to better understand how the curb is being used. And so this is where if from the realm of curb management, cities often don't know how, especially in their loading zones, how their loading zones are being used today. And so they don't have the insight to be able to know whether they need more of that type of curb designation. If autonomous vehicles, for example, are able to share the pickup and drop-off locations, then that can make a really strong policy case for cities to designate more space, particular times of the day, particular blocks, in order to facilitate that safe loading and unloading of passengers. That's just kind of one kind of example use case of that ties into the autonomous vehicle discussion. All right. Great. Then I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague Angela, who's going to talk about a little more about specific use cases and benefits of MDS and CDS.
Yeah, this is the perfect segue. So I'm going to share some case studies from real life MDS use in cities. And these are just a sampling pulled from various public reports that themselves kind of wouldn't be possible without MDS. So several cities around the country, particularly in relation to their micromobility programs, because that's kind of how MDS got its start, were able to publish really detailed public reports about their programs. So this first example here comes from the city of Chicago, which, like many cities, doesn't allow dockless e-scooters through some of their large parks during large-scale public events, like in this case, a music festival. So in this example, the city set up a geofence area to keep the sidewalks clear so that folks can, easily access the event and, reduce kind of safety issues for festival goers. And so the map here illustrates the geofence. And you can see the geofence around Union Park on the weekend of Pitchfork Music Festival. And so through MDS, the city was able to, one, digitally communicate what that geofence was, and then assess compliance with the geofence and make corrections where needed with operators. So all those little blue dots are where the micromobility trip ended. So it's also clear that e-scooters played a really big role in transporting attendees to the festival, which is useful for transportation planning for future events. So for example, the city can set up temporary bike and scooter parking areas or mobility hubs with charging stations, things like that. And this also has applications with other modes of transportation like taxis or robo-taxis, helping cities kind of plan those pickup and drop-off areas outside events or geofence around parades, even things like work zones or emergency response activities. The second example also just happens to be from Chicago. But as many of you know, cities set up geographic equity zones or kind of priority areas to ensure that shared e-scooters are available in low-income neighborhoods, or other areas of interest, right, to ensure equitable access to these services. So the chart here shows that availability in Chicago's priority areas was higher in the mornings as the fleets were set up for morning commutes. But later in the day, and this is presumably after riders take vehicles to different areas, and as operators are rebalancing their fleets, there's less availability in those priority areas versus the rest of the pilot area. So again, they're using MDS to really measure the equitable distribution of services.
And when we see cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco converting their taxi systems to MDS, one of the first sort of case studies they will example for why they're doing that is to better understand across the city the level of equitable response times. So are taxis, for example, responding to certain parts of the city, faster, more often than other perhaps more disadvantaged parts of the city, and that can easily be shown through MDS data.
Yes, and this last one, kind of similar to the first example, but cities can publish digital policy for operators around all types of kind of special areas, so restricted areas, no parking, speed restrictions, things like that. And this example comes from Louisville, around the use of, again, dockless scooters. So the restricted area was around the American Printing House for the Blind campus, where visually impaired students and workers couldn't deal with kind of sidewalk riding and parking and obstructions of that nature. And then other no parking areas were for the waterfront park area along the river, which is just for pedestrians. And then speed restriction policies were included here and the main university campus to the south. And so again, you can kind of see this having applications across different modes of transportation. Cities can publish emergency response information and update digital policies like this on the fly for passenger services companies and fleets. And so overall, I'm not going to go over every single kind of detail that we see in terms of how standards benefit both public and private sectors. You can read them here, but I think, what we hear from our cities is that really MDS gives them insight into how the public realm is being used, and really, more importantly, kind of helps them say yes to new innovations, right? To be able to welcome, whether it's e-scooters or autonomous vehicles, delivery robots, these new innovations onto their street, but still be able to manage the public space for the public good in a kind of responsible, transparent, and accountable way. And then on the operator side, MDS and CDS really help establish this kind of mutual trust between cities and operators. And so being able to kind of seamlessly and in a standard way communicate with each other really kind of helps level the playing field. And it also provides scale for operators. I can say this because I came from a micromobility company before this. It is a lot easier to build to a single standard than have a team of 25 people pulling bespoke reports for cities around the world. And so when you're looking at the ability to scale, you really need a standard that you can build to. So that is why we've, traditionally seen a lot of participation from both public and private sectors.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Michael. And I just want to end by reiterating a point that both of them made, is that the use of MDS for managing shared mobility is not new. It's now been done for several years in cities around the world. And it's a tried and tested method for both receiving information about the activities of those shared mobility services on the streets of our cities, but also be able to communicate digital policy in a standardized format back to those operators. And so the application of MDS over the past few years has primarily been around micromobility services. But now with the release of MDS 2.0 back in May, we're seeing cities, as I mentioned, convert their taxi fleets, look at converting car share services and more shared mobility services into MDS, so they have the ability to demonstrate that two-way form of communication and be able to have more of a complete picture and understanding and ability to manage what's going on their streets. All right, with that, happy to answer any questions and go from there.
Thank you, Andrew, Angela, and Michael. Questions or comments? Representative Kloba.
Yep, it's me again. I really appreciate the ability, your presentation here and explaining something that wouldn't necessarily be obvious to, just Joe on the street, that all of this coordination is happening. And I am, though, old enough to remember other standards that were put in place for things like videotapes. And so the whole beta of Max VHS, which was going to be the right standard that the world adopted. And, we ended up with VHS. And with chargers, electric vehicle chargers, we're starting to see some coalescing around one particular standard, but it started with a couple. And so I was just curious if that is something that you're seeing in this particular industry sector. Are there other people, or is the fact that you started, it sounds like from the beginning, with an open, open source product that has set the standard?
Yeah, in many ways, that's a great question. And there are other standards out in the ecosystem that do similar things. One that I'll mention is actually a set of standards, GTFS, or the General Transit Feed Specification, or GBFS, the General Bike Share Feed Specification. These often kind of get a little bit confused with MDS in particular, but they're doing very, very different things. MDS is about facilitating the kind of internal management of shared mobility services and public space, whereas these other standards they're important standards for you to be able to identify when your bus or next train is coming, or where the bus stop is, what's the schedule, when you look at Google Maps, or when you look at another third-party app to try to find the location of the bus stop, or when the next bus is coming, or where that scooter or bike is that you want to find. They're very public facing. So that's an example of how there are standards that are in this space that are similar, but not actually competing, because they're performing very different functions. I would say that one other comment is that MDS really came from this kind of ground up need from cities, and there was no authority telling cities they had to adopt MDS, that it would be the standard from a state or from a nation or from a supranation body. It was very much became a de facto global standard. And so while it continues to be of a value add for cities, we believe they will continue to adopt it and use it, which is why the evolution, the ongoing steward of these standards is so important, so that it's not a matter of doing it and done. They're really meant to be living entities, so that they can keep pace with this constant evolution and change within transportation digitization that we're seeing. So right now, short answer to your question, there is no real competitor to MDS or CDS. That doesn't mean that there won't be, but we're going to continue to work with our public and private partners to make sure that these standards are aligned with both the operational needs and also the outcome needs, that they're driving towards those safety, equity, climate change outcomes that they're really wanting to drive in their agencies.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the responses. Other questions or comments for our panelists? I'm not seeing anybody. Andrew, Angela, Michael, thank you so much for your presentation this morning. We appreciate your informative discussion and I'm looking forward to hearing more about MDS in the future. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jim. And the presentation that we sent over that you should all have access to has additional resources kind of after we had shared an abbreviated presentation with you. There's a lot more content in there for those that want to dive a little bit deeper. It's there for your reading and exploring pleasure. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Okay. Next item on the agenda is the subcommittee's final updates. And we have a panel of individuals, committee members. And I understand, Allison Drake, you are first up.
Good morning. I will get my camera going. Just one moment. Okay.
Good morning.
Here we go. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Drake, and I'm the Policy and Stakeholder Engagement Advisor in the Division of Occupational Safety and Health at the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries. I'm one of the co-chairs of the AV Work Group's Workforce Subcommittee, and I'm joined today by Caitlin Jekyll. Caitlin is the Government Relations Director at the Employment Security Department and a fellow co-chair of the Workforce Subcommittee. The agenda does also list Brenda Wiest from the Teamsters, who unfortunately was not able to join us today. So the Workforce Subcommittee was specifically tasked with examining a number of things. So worker retraining and transition, worker replacement and job loss, industry impacts, as well as worker safety and worker rights. So we just first want to thank the AV Work Group, our fellow subcommittee members, and everyone who has contributed to this effort over the last 5 years. This work, although not always easy, has consistently been collaborative and engaging. Especially during COVID, the Workforce Subcommittee co-chairs shifted a lot of our focus to pandemic response, and we were not as plugged into the work as early on in this effort as we would have hoped, but we appreciate the grace that this group has shown and appreciate the opportunity to now provide these recommendations in the work group's final report. We've also really enjoyed getting to engage with our business and labor partners throughout this effort, and we're excited to share our recommendations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Caitlin to give a brief overview of our research efforts and a high-level summary of our recommendations, which will be reflected in greater detail in the work group's final report. And I will go ahead and share my screen.
All right. Thank you very much, Allison, for the introduction and everybody for the opportunity to share with you today. As Allison said, I'll walk through our recommendations and then open the floor for any questions. We started our work, and you can switch to the next slide, Allison. We started our work by engaging with a researcher at Washington State University to assist with a literature review and analysis of the occupations that are most likely to experience disruption and change associated with the adoption of AV technology as a grounding foundation to help us together come up with the recommendations that you're seeing reflected in the final report. So some of the things that are noted as the most likely impacts within this section of the literature review were things like rideshare and taxi drivers that are likely to be experiencing major disruption, with similar driving jobs unlikely to return at the point at which AV technology would be replacing that work. Same with drone technology affecting package service delivery, where right now there are plentiful opportunities in that particular occupation. Those are likely to go away over time. Other jobs we noted require a bit more analysis on what that transition will look like and how workers and employers will work together on making these transitions, like truck drivers who right now, in addition to piloting their vehicles, also monitor loads, unload cargo, perform basic maintenance functions. There is a world where perhaps the driving component of that work changes substantially, and yet some work remains. Similarly, in public transportation and school transportation, where the driver's job may start to resemble more that of a railroad conductor. So with all that in mind, the work group came up with a couple of categories of recommendations. So let's advance the slide, please. So the first recommendation category is around the limitations in existing data. This isn't unique to driving occupations, but there are some components that make it in particular challenging. Existing administrative data that we have is quite limited in its ability to break down a sector into various components parts. NAICS codes, which provide the most granular level of detail that we have, are reported in our unemployment insurance system, which would miss many key individuals such as independent operating truck drivers, gig workers, and things of the like. So the work group recommends that as the state consider further adoption of AV technology, that we pay particular attention to the analysis of where workers are, the labor market trends, their wages, things of that regard, and to do so incorporating tools such as worker surveys to help us gain a better understanding of workforce impacts as we move forward. The next recommendations, if we can move the slide. The next recommendation suggests that we consider policies that support worker transition. This is important both for the workers and for employers that are trying to maintain a workforce where folks are anticipating significant change on the horizon, that we be able to support this transition with people seeing opportunity to transition with this change in connection to the industry itself. So those recommendations include things like updating commercial driver training and credentialing in partnership with industry and worker organizations and colleges to change the way we're training for these careers. On-the-job training activities that help people stay connected to the job, continuing to earn money and industry recognized credentials while changing to the technology as it moves. And job matching and career counseling services that are more tailored specifically to this type of industry transition. The next bucket of recommendations looked at the types of supports and social safety net programs that are available to transitioning workers and how they would be impacted in this particular transition. So we talked about training. We also suggested things like retirement buyout packages in lieu of job training for those individuals that are close to retirement but need to bridge that gap. We discussed things like limitations in the WARN Act for folks to have a clear understanding of when a transition would be happening and being able to prepare accordingly. And we suggested things like looking at best practices from federal programs such as the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act that does things like healthcare and wage subsidies and relocation assistance that aren't typically available for a traditional dislocated worker. So in all, the recommendations that you'll see reflected in the report suggests that we both analyze the impact so we have a better sense of scale and scope, where these individuals are, at what volume, and then as we consider further adoption of technology, work together to look at the way we can shore up some of these supportive services. And with that, Allison, let's go to the last slide, and we're happy to open the floor to any questions if folks have them.
Questions or comments? I'm not seeing any. So, well, thank you so much for your presentation and for all the work that you did on the subcommittee. We really appreciate the interaction that we had from your group. If we do have questions, we'll make sure we get them to you, but I don't see anything right now. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to Dr. Andrew Dannenberg. Dr. Dannenberg, are you there? Good morning.
Yes, I am here.
You have the floor, sir.
Okay, could I have the first slide?
Yep, I am pulling them up right now. Give me one.
Okay, thank you. Great. All right, thank you. I'm speaking for the Health and Equity Subcommittee, and I want to thank the other members of the group. I will say the group had a number of great people giving various input at various times. Next slide, please. And I work in environmental health and urban planning at the University of Washington, where I'm coming from. I'm a physician with a public health background. The purpose of our group was to look at the health and equity issues related to the wider implementation of autonomous vehicles and to see that the health benefits of automated mobility would be equitably distributed and that the negative impacts would not be disproportionately borne by various communities that are traditionally marginalized. As we looked at health and equity issues, we found that some of the health issues were being focused on elsewhere, particularly the safety issues had a separate subcommittee, so we did not spend a lot of time on safety since there was a separate subcommittee, and we focused more on the equity issues. Equity is a term that I think many people are well aware of, but it's sort of what is buried in that term is what we were trying to flesh out and come up with recommendations that would relate to what those equity issues are and to propose some actions that would address that. And the one message I want out of this, my entire presentation, is that the final report try to say more than just we should address equity, but actually try to get some of these specific equity issues and potential ways to address them into the report in more detail than simply saying, yes, we should address equity. Next slide. So equity is a state where everybody has a fair opportunity to attain really the highest quality of health and highest quality of lifestyle. And it really requires some active efforts to address historical and current injustices and overcome obstacles to health and health care. And access to transportation is one of the determinants of health. People who have access to transportation can get to health care, but also get to such things as healthy food and places for physical activity and jobs and education and the whole range of things that lead to a healthy lifestyle. You need access to transportation, and autonomous vehicles are one of those types of transportation that what the whole committee is about is looking at how will they fit into how society deals with people getting to places. Next slide. So what we did is we broke down through various discussions, both in the literature and the various people who were on the committee, and said, what are some of the issues for which we should be concerned about equity? And I think I have 8 of them listed on the next several slides. I just want to run through them and give an idea of the types of ways that you could address some of these equity issues once bringing them up. The first one has to do with community priorities, that we need outreach to various communities, particularly underprivileged communities, as to what are they concerned about. And it may be that if the society wants to spend a lot of money fixing infrastructure that strictly benefits autonomous vehicle users, that at least in some communities, you may hear, if you do community outreach, that there are other things that are more important than autonomous vehicles, that an underserved community may really want better sidewalks and better improvements to transit before they have any interest in improving infrastructure that strictly is intended for autonomous vehicle users. So I think that needs to be considered. What are the community priorities before a lot of resources go into infrastructure that is directed at autonomous vehicles? The second one, and really related to the first one, is that many people may know very little about autonomous vehicles. And so that some outreach and education about what autonomous vehicles can and can't do is really important before going out to a community, particularly one that may have not a lot of education or may not have English as the first language, that some education and outreach needs to go on as to what autonomous vehicles are. And that might be a matter of, here are some scenarios of what could happen in the future, and then ask for feedback to that. So I think that education and outreach needs to go along with any outreach to communities. The third one is access to autonomous vehicle services, that as companies look at where they want their autonomous vehicles to go, that there needs to be some look at what those service areas are. And if the service areas only are places of upper income, and that the training data used for these autonomous vehicles only come from those upper income areas or medium to upper income areas, then the low income areas really are not going to get the benefit from the service and will not have been in the training data. So I think that needs to probably be on the government level of reviewing what service areas are proposed by the providers of autonomous vehicles. Next slide. The next is who will have access to the autonomous vehicles. Obviously, there is a cost to using autonomous vehicles. They do depend on having smartphones and credit cards, and persons with low incomes may just not have access to autonomous vehicles. So there's an equity in access issue. And so there's some of the ways to address that is we may need some service subsidies to make autonomous vehicles available in lower income areas. We also may want to incentivize shared autonomous vehicles, that some of the benefit of autonomous vehicles will be when they can be shared by multiple people. And so there may be ways to incentivize that. The next one is disparities in infrastructure investments. And as mentioned, if we do want to spend some money on infrastructure improvements that would help AVs, there are some things that would help everybody and some that would help just the autonomous vehicle. So for example, if you fix the lane markings and fix the potholes so that autonomous vehicles can use the roads more easily, well, that helps everybody who uses those roads. But if we spend a lot of resource on extended mapping and on road-to-vehicle communication technology in some of these areas, they really are not helping lower-income people. They're strictly helping the AV users. So it's a disparities issue, an equity issue of where we spend societal resources on infrastructure investments for autonomous vehicles. The next one is looking at what some of the barriers to shared autonomous vehicle use are, and especially safety for women came up repeatedly, that that for AVs to have fewer people on the road or fewer vehicles on the road, we need more shared vehicles. But it certainly can be uncomfortable, and this is where women came up repeatedly, getting into a shared vehicle with an unknown person, possibly same sex, opposite sex, or whatever. So we need ways that people can be comfortable sharing autonomous vehicles. It may include such things as cameras inside the autonomous vehicles. It may be panic or emergency call buttons. And it may be a way of selecting your rideshare partner, but that gets into some discrimination issues. So it's not an easy answer, but if we want shared AVs, we need it so that all users are comfortable with them as an equity issue. If it's not comfortable, then women and others may not be willing to use them. Next. Another that really I've not heard a lot addressed, but is often talked about is, autonomous vehicles will make transportation much easier for people with disabilities. But at least many of the autonomous vehicle talks and things that I've heard really are not well equipped to accommodate wheelchairs or to accommodate people who may need help getting in and out of the car. Obviously, if there's no driver there that can give a hand, an autonomous vehicle may not be that useful for people with disabilities. And so that also is a fairly important equity issue. And so it may be that some autonomous vehicles need to exceed ADA minimum standards, may need to accommodate wheelchairs. And I think some resource needs to go into how autonomous vehicles can accommodate people with disabilities. As I say, it's often claimed that they will, but then it really hasn't been clear how that will actually happen. And then the final one was just described very well by Labor and Industries as a potential disruption of existing transportation jobs. And there are quite a few people who are not that high on the income scale. I mean, particularly ride hailing and taxi jobs and some bus and truck drivers, that there would need to be job retraining so that the people who lose jobs or potentially out of autonomous vehicles could have retraining. And I think Labor and Industries had some very good recommendations that we would support for that. Next slide. So our one recommendation that we did present to this work group previously, and it was supported but did not go anywhere when it got further up the chain, was to have active public outreach. And it's because marginalized communities really are not being heard in existing processes and are not likely to come to public meetings and are not well represented among the decision makers. And so that active outreach would increase the potential for more equitable access and mobility. Next slide. And that outreach should be a structured public engagement process, and it would probably be done by a transportation agency and would have some cost to it. And we picked a number, $30,000 would give you some outreach. That is a somewhat arbitrary number. It could be more or less than that. But that active outreach to the communities who are not typically represented, I think could go a long way into having equity considered in where the implementation of autonomous vehicles goes. Next. And if there is such outreach, it could help reduce the inequities and would help policymakers make decisions. Next. So that's the main issue. Is I think there are major equity concerns. I am hoping the final report will go into some detail and bring up some of these specific issues. The version that I saw just talked about let's consider equity, and I would really like to see further details make it into the final report of what some of the equity issues are and what some of those approaches are. And with that, thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dannenberg. Questions or comments? Yes, Armand.
Yes, thank you so much. This was a great presentation. I just wanted to throw out for the group that at the Seattle Department of Transportation, we have a permit program for AV testing, and one of the permit requirements is public outreach. And when thinking about how we wanted to construct that public outreach, we decided that for this first permit year, we'll be working with our vendors and community groups to conduct an inclusive planning process. So we're in the process of kicking that off, which includes having a cohort of community members that represent diverse perspectives to come and tell us about their transportation experiences broadly, and then invite the industry to talk about various AV use cases and hear from the community as to what use cases are most valuable to them, and also which ones we may want to work with the industry on refining or prioritizing for deployment in the city. So we are planning to kick that off in the beginning of next year, and we would be really happy to continue sharing that progress with this group, recognizing that the group is formally sunsetting, but we would definitely be happy to keep everyone updated.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I can add one quick thing, I just came off a meeting with the Seattle Planning Commission that I sit on, and for the city of Seattle comprehensive plan, they did active outreach where they gave out money to selected competitive community groups and had those community groups do the outreach and then provide a report of what outreach they had accomplished. And it was a way of really digging in fairly deep by giving money to community groups to actually get in depth into some of that input from the community.
Interesting. Thank you, Doctor. And thank you, Armand. Other questions or comments? Okay. All right. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the work that you did on the subcommittee. Please thank your fellow colleagues there on your committee as well. We appreciate all the information that they provided.
Thank you.
Okay. Bo Perschbacher. Bo, are you out there?
Oh, I'm here. Yep. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
All
And
right.
Markella, are you okay pulling up the slides for me, or do you need me to do that? Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Bo Perschbacher, Legislative Policy Director, Department of Licensing, co-chair of the licensing subcommittee. Like other presenters, I do want to thank everyone over the years that has participated and helped us craft our recommendations for that group. So let's go to the next slide. Here's a quick overview of just some of the items that we're going to cover, some of the recommendations we did get passed, and some that are still outstanding for consideration. Next slide. So one of the ones early on that we got passed that was supported by multiple subcommittees that were part of this process, was removing the prohibition on television screens in vehicles. Certainly any of us that have ridden in AV knows that that's very common, that you'll see that. And so that was an early win in the process that was voted through by the legislature, and that's, was changed in the law. So that was one subcommittee recommendation that did get passed. You can go to the next slide. One of the biggest ones that I still think is probably my biggest disappointment that we weren't able to get this changed is the law enforcement interaction plan. Our subcommittee looked at this, recommended it, as well as others set the process. It's very common when you look at other states. Just to give one sense here, California, Arizona, sort of on, different regulatory frameworks in both those states. California, more intensive process, lighter touch in Arizona. Both of them, though, have this law enforcement interaction plan. For those that aren't familiar with it, what this is really about is requiring companies that are, for us, self-certified in our state, to have a plan published about how first responders and law enforcement will interact with the AVs, particularly in situations where that AV is it's stuck on the side of the road, maybe it got in a collision, something's happened to it, and it helps them just understand how to safely get that vehicle, out of the public roadway, get a hold of the company, all those types of items. So I do hope that as we continue to look at AV issues in the legislature in the future, that we don't forget about the law enforcement interaction plan, because I haven't found anyone yet that didn't like it. I think that was one of the few areas of consensus where it seemed like everyone that we talked to in the subcommittee and in our just broader discussions with the industry supported this concept. Next slide. And so one of the other outstanding recommendations that wasn't passed was giving rulemaking authority for the Department of Licensing around autonomous vehicles. As you may know, we do administer the self-certified program for the state right now. I know that there was some sort of late-breaking industry concerns about this recommendation, and certainly it's not, if there's not a lot of comfort with that. I think there are other ways to still accomplish what this was intended to achieve, which was just being able to build out some more of that framework, including potentially doing a law enforcement interaction plan through rulemaking, right? If we had that authority, we wouldn't necessarily need the legislature to spell that out for the companies. But knowing that when we originally, when this was, included as part of the bill, a couple sessions back, there were some concerns the industry expressed. And so just sort of calling it also out so that we can have some sense of the history of where we've been, right? And those things that were outstanding. And so finally, I guess I would just say the other big item that we were never able to get to a subcommittee recommendation on was the path to deployment. I think that's the biggest outstanding sort of licensing regulatory issue that we're still facing. And I hope that even though the work group is sunsetting, that we can continue. This process has certainly helped us identify many of the stakeholders that are interested in these items. And I hope that we can continue to work collaboratively to try to get that figured out, working with the industry and other stakeholders and partners. So that's where I'll end, Mr. Chair. I do want to thank everyone again, but I do think there's probably some unfinished business here. And so I hope that we can continue to collaborate in the future.
Thank you, Bo. Questions or comments for Bo? Yes, Shelley.
I just want to reiterate what Bo said about the work plans for law enforcement. That was a strong recommendation from the Safety Committee as well. We are also disappointed that it didn't gain enough traction to make it through the process. We think it's really important, and I think we can see some examples out in the use of driverless AV, safety driverless AV vehicles out where it's been a critical issue. So we'd like to also support that recommendation. Bo, thanks for making it.
Thank you, Shelley. We appreciate your comments as well. And I agree with you. So, other questions or comments? Yes, Armand.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I also wanted to reiterate on the law enforcement plan. As part of our city permit, we do require a law enforcement interaction and disengagement plan, which has been really popular with Seattle Police and Fire. However, we also wanted to note that through the requirement of the plan, we've determined through engagement with police and fire some areas that are not covered. One specifically is the plans often require that a firefighter or police officer call a phone number or scan a QR code when engaging with a vehicle. And for our fire department, at least, often the firefighters do not have cell phones with them when they're responding and are wearing equipment that makes it unlikely that they could use a cell phone to first call a company. And then the second being that It can also be quite cumbersome to remember which plan is for which vehicle type, especially as different vehicles and some AV companies have multiple different vehicles that they use for testing and deployment. So that's another area. And then the last one being standardization among how to actually disengage the vehicle. While the plan is helpful in an event that first responders are at a scene, having to remember the steps that might be different for each vehicle type can also be confusing, and often they don't necessarily have the plan available at that given moment for them to reference. So there were just a couple things that we learned through this process that we've been going through as well.
Thank you, Armand. Appreciate that. Representative Kloba.
Yeah, thank you. This has been an issue that I have given some attention to before, and I think kind of took a pass on it last session, but certainly understand that it is still a big concern amongst our first responders. And so I don't know, Bo or somebody else from the committee or the subcommittee could help me understand, like, did you go into any specifics about whether it's a push notification or if it's something that law enforcement has to actively seek the information about the response plans, or like, did you go into a lot of detail or not really?
Okay, so I think I understand. Right, and so on the issue of the law enforcement interaction plan, at least at the state level, sort of works in tandem with the notification that testing is going to be occurring, in a sense, right? Is how we envisioned it originally. So that is part of the law, that they do have to provide advance notification of testing that's occurring, and that is to like local law enforcement and, you know, the state patrol that's going to be on the public highways. And that is more of, I think, when you're getting at, Rep. Kloba, the idea of that push notification, that's what I think of when you say that, is that it's like, hey, we're going to be in this area doing this testing. The way we envision the law enforcement interaction plan interacting with that is that that's just this sort of standing published protocol for how, and Armand, your feedback was so helpful on what the realities have been on the ground of that. But it's just this sort of document that we just would have on file, we would make available once we received it from the companies, that states, this is what to do if you find one on the side of the road and it's, you know, it's not working, right? It's blocking traffic. This is how you can try to get into it, disable it, get a hold of the company. And so it's just sort of a standing thing. It would be updated if something changed with the company, but then you would use that in combination with the notification. So it's like, okay, we know they'll be in our jurisdiction testing. We've got the law enforcement interaction plan. We feel like we know what to do, right? At least in theory, that's how we envisioned it working.
I see. Okay. And I think, again, I would echo your comments about Armand's comments being very helpful. And I think it'll be important to understand how first responders work in terms of they train for, you know, eventual situations that they may come upon. And so having a document is one thing. And I think actively having trained for those scenarios or similar scenarios is another piece of that interaction plan, and perhaps could kind of get us to resolve some of the issues that Armand was talking about, you know, without a cell phone or whatever. And if you drilled and had those scenarios that you trained on, you find those things. So it seems like there's still a lot of development to do around this. And I look forward to working with you all on that.
Yeah, I totally agree, Rep. Kloba. And I do think too, that was part of some of the reason why we had suggested giving ourselves rulemaking authority, is because it's hard to anticipate at the time all the possible permutations of things that you'll need, or, you know, like kind of Armand shared, when they're actually getting into it, what they've discovered, right? If that's something at a statewide level we want to implement, you know, legislature meets once a year. It's a process. Sometimes it's easier if it's a little bit more in the weeds to just be able to set up some of those guardrails, working on our own timeline with all the interested parties. So that was part of the thinking, even if it were to be boxed in more. I think sometimes there was concerns about the rulemaking be too open-ended in terms of our authority. Even if there were guardrails, I still think there could be some benefit there, so that it's not having to be so prescriptive at the RCW level.
Good points, Bo. Other questions, comments? Okay, thank you so much, Bo. Appreciate your presentation and all the work that the subcommittee did. So, and we'll be taking all of your ideas to the commission. So appreciate that as well. Okay, next we have David Fort from the
Hi.
OIC.
Thank
Good
you, Chair. Markel, would you be able to bring the slides up? Thank you so much. So good morning, executive committee members and interested parties. I am David Fort. I serve as the Senior Policy Advisor for Property and Casualty Insurance at the Office of the Insurance Commissioner. I've supported the chairs of the Liability Subcommittee or co-chaired it over the years. First off, I'd like to say thank you for allowing the Office of the Insurance Commissioner to participate on this journey. Thank you to Chair Restucci and Vice Chair Batra and the Washington State Transportation Commission for your leadership. Besides the Office of the Insurance Commissioner, PIMCO Mutual Insurance Company served as co-chair and was a valued partner. The OIC is very thankful for Harris Clark and PIMCO's contributions and all the subcommittee members that took the time and effort to provide input. Personal thank you to Rima and Markel for keeping the trains on time and being such a reliable resource for me. Because of this working group, the Office of the Insurance Commissioner is far better positioned to understand the crossroads of autonomous vehicles and insurance in order to uphold our mission to protect consumers in a healthy insurance market for Washington State. Next slide, please. I just want to mention a few items the subcommittee touched on over the years. Really, for the first year and a half, the subcommittee focused on the testing environment. We researched how other states were handling liability requirements for testing vehicles. That work resulted in a recommendation to this executive committee and eventually became law in 2020. The subcommittee then focused on researching how liability concerns interact with autonomous vehicles in a mixed environment. So an environment where all 6 levels of SAE driving automation are sharing the roadways. We had discussions with experts on the safety data being collected. We met with drafters of the Uniform Law Commission Model Act around AVs. And here we learned of the concern of the possibilities that product liability coverage may overtake current auto liability as the primary source of liability coverage in level 4 and 5 autonomous vehicles. And this led to discussions on the importance of consumer protections and a well-developed mechanism to assign liability, getting cars repaired, medical costs paid for that exist within auto insurance. Moving to a third-party based product liability coverage scheme would likely be inefficient and require many changes to the state's insurance code. This consumer protection concern became a continuing theme that we heard of from many of the experts we spoke with. Next slide. We then heard from attorneys and judges that participate in liability litigation within Washington State. And they reported to us they have many of the tools already in place that they need to work on large damage cases involving autonomous vehicles, whether it be auto liability or product liability. However, all identified a concern around small damage liability assignments and consumer protections. They identified that access to data that is available within the autonomous vehicle, which can quickly determine who is at fault, the timeliness of receiving the data, and the affordability of receiving the data were all important items to consider moving forward. This data collection concern also became a continuing theme, and we especially heard it from the insurance industry. We're also discussed with how other states defined a driver and how they are adapting their state laws to incorporate autonomous vehicle operations. The subcommittee provided the technical memo to the working group. Next slide. We also met with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners federal policy staff to discuss federal action on autonomous vehicles. They reported there was not enough cooperative effort in Congress to move the AV issue forward. So the hope for federal guidance seemed unlikely at that time, as it does today. Next slide. So our closing comments to our state leaders and policymakers as they carry on the efforts around autonomous vehicle deployment are, as you consider what should become the norm for AV liability recovery, the current system of auto liability has far more consumer protections in place than costly and litigious environment of product liability. And probably more important, please consider ways to create a process where data collected by autonomous vehicles that can provide law enforcement, consumers, insurance companies, the information to assign who is at fault and how the incident occurred be transferred to these entities in a timely and inexpensive manner. Last slide. So again, thank you for allowing the Office of the Insurance Commissioner to participate, and we are happy to be a technical resource to any of you in the future.
Thank you so much, David. Questions or comments for David? Yes, Armand.
Thank you, Chair. I did have a quick question. So when we launched our local permit program, we added additional insurance requirements that supplement the state's current requirements. And one of those is technology error and emissions coverage. And something that we saw is that some AV companies are newer or have not been around for so long and don't necessarily have a profitable business model at this time. And when we launched the permit program, the permitted entities that we have elected to self-insure that technology errors and emissions coverage. And so we were only able to then issue permits to companies with a demonstration of enough holdings to adequately meet that coverage. And so I'm curious if there's been any further development on how to address that need. And some basis for that requirement is we've seen some AV companies under active investigation by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration for defects on the driving system. So it was important that we kept the technology error and emissions coverage, but we have seen we want to essentially be able to understand like where we can streamline insurance as feasible and how that might also be adopted potentially at the state so that we can potentially in the future offload that to the state rather than having this local requirement.
Well, I'm not sure if there is a streamlined process now available. I think part of it will rely on federal guidance and especially as it goes to the specific products within the vehicle. I think we really got to wait for the feds to provide safety guidance there. So unfortunately, I think that's a good idea, what you guys did. I don't think there's a way to streamline it right now, though.
Thank you, David. Other questions or comments? Okay, any questions for any of the subcommittees? So thank you so much to the subcommittee members and the co-chairs. I want to thank on behalf of Vice Chair Batra and the commission, I want to thank you for all the work that you did in providing this work group with the information that it needed to make informed decisions. So we're going to go ahead and take a break now. Okay, are we ready to go ahead and start? All right, next up we have the 2024 legislative session, and it is my honor to hand the chair over to what I would consider our most strongest supporter in the legislature, and someone who the legislator who has come to more meetings than any other member of the legislature. So I really appreciate everything that you've done for the work group, Representative Kloba, and you have the floor.
Well, it's totally been my pleasure, and none of us would be here were it not for former representative and current WATEC staffer Zach Hudgens. So, kind of a hat tip to him for
yes,
putting this all in place, and that was when my interest originally was piqued. So, I feel like this work will never be done. And so this is kind of my most recent effort. And I'm really pleased that the way that you designed the agenda was that the liability subgroup or subcommittee's report was just before mine, because it does really dovetail very nicely into this work being something that responds to some of the concerns that group came up with. So I think there are lots of different things that we disagree on in this work group, and that has been very interesting and thought-provoking, and I really appreciate all the different conversations. But I think there's some things that we can certainly agree on. One is that there will be a transition period of some length of time where human-driven and computer-driven cars or vehicles will be sharing the road together. Don't know how long that will take, but in the meantime, I think another thing we can agree on is that it's going to be important to understand how does safety interact, and what happens when, heaven forbid, cars crash into each other or into a pedestrian or other road user and cause loss, whether it's property or life or injury. And so I think if we can go to the next slide, we can kind of start out with the problem statement. And this was alluded to by David Fort, that our current tort system is unworkable in practice for this kind of AV technology. And so one of the reasons is that, and he highlighted this, it's like we work together, only we didn't. The burden of proof of the defective product is on the victim, the person who has sustained the loss. And another problematic area is that the access to information about the crash and the time immediately before and after the crash. This is the kind of information that is generally collected at a crash scene. However, we've seen that sometimes companies are reluctant to share this information with, concerns over intellectual property. We've actually seen that sometimes they will share partial information, like we saw in the recent cruise pedestrian collision, and not share the full information. And then I think the cost to pursue a claim can be very expensive when the expectation is that you are going to have to mount a product liability claim. It requires proof of a manufacturing defect or a technical flaw in the AV tech stack, and that would really require experts in the field, and it would be kind of beyond the reach of just the normal person. I think it would make it very difficult to prove these kinds of things in one of the most complex products that is currently in use in our country. I think many would agree with that. And so on the next slide, I've got a proposed solution, and I'm not going to necessarily read it all to you. It comes directly from the work of Dr. Koopman and Professor Wyden, and I've got their info there, but I think we've had them appear and present to us before, so I think a lot of you are familiar. But by creating this legal fiction of a computer driver, you could apply just ordinary negligence liability anytime that there has been a loss, and the standard that you're being held to here is that, or that the computer driver would be held to, is the level of care we'd expect from an unimpaired and attentive human driver in the similar circumstances. So I think if we flip to the next slide, the benefits of that is that it assigns a liability to the entity that controls the vehicle operations. And the reason that's important is I think we want to make sure that for instance, the passengers in the vehicle who maybe have no opportunity to control it are not implicated in any of the fault there. I think I sort of alluded to this before, but the expectation that the performance, we're not expecting an AV to be safer than a human driver who's exercising a duty of care and behaving responsibly. But we just want them to be as safe as. So I think it's a very reasonable standard that I think AV companies should be able to aspire to, and certainly people could argue that they're already there today. It does allow it to operate on a case-by-case basis. You don't have to take on the whole company and their whole line of cars that are similar to the ones that were in the crash. And it keeps the AV liability in that kind of automobile insurance framework, that the personal negligence claims. And, this is a system that we are all familiar with. It's what we have in place. It's been well worked out. Drivers and insurers know how this process works. If any of you have had the misfortune of being in some kind of a crash with your vehicle, you'll know it's not always super fun, but I think it's a process and we all know what it is. So on the next slide, I go into just a little bit about how the bill accomplishes those things. And so it creates some definitions, and I think that's an important place to start. And I think that was something that, no, actually, I'm thinking the next, I'm getting ahead of myself. So things like, what is an AV? It defines what is a computer driver? How do you define manufacturer? What would you define as undue risk? So it has all of that terminology that's laid out in the first section of it. And it goes on to explain what is duty of care and what will constitute a breach of that duty. And it holds the manufacturer financially responsible for the losses caused by the ordinary or gross negligence of the computer driver. And so say, for instance, I think this becomes important when we have folks who own AVs, and they're not the person who has any ability to change the safety or the operations of that AV. They are just the owner. And so for them to be liable seems like you would be putting it in the wrong place. And so it holds that manufacturer financially responsible. It also addresses what happens in testing mode. And I think that's been an important thing. This group is very familiar with why that's important. And then we've got that kind of difficult phase when the AV is shifting the responsibility back to the human driver in cases where there's an opportunity to do that and the driver has controls that they can manipulate. It establishes a buffer of time so that once the human driver or person sitting in the driver's seat is alerted that they have to take on responsibility for the car, they have like a 10-second buffer to resume control of the car and understand the environment and what's happening around it. All right, so next slide. So my next steps are to continue to get input from stakeholders. I've begun that process. I've given my legislative assistant a whole list of people to get meetings with, and throughout that, I'm gonna go ahead and refine the draft that's based on the feedback that I hear. And next slide. That's how you can connect with me. I certainly look forward to conversations about this topic, but I do think it's timely, and I think it is one of the ways that we can give some additional meaning to this work group and the efforts that everyone has made in terms of their time and their talents, and by carrying out at least one of the recommendations that the work group is putting forward, specifically the liability subcommittee, I feel like we can give meaning to the work that we've done so far. So really appreciate you listening. Happy to answer any questions. And I know I went faster than you probably anticipated, so we may get done earlier today, or we may have a lot of time for questions, but yeah.
That's okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. Questions or comments for Representative Kloba? Yes, David.
So yeah, thank you for the presentation, and Zach and David, I appreciate the work you guys have done this on the liability subcommittee and then working with Representative Kloba here. I think from the VS perspective, and we'd be happy to have further conversations with you. We work with this in a lot of contexts, and I think, we do believe that there is a workable construct in the current system, right? I mean, we believe that defects liability does account for, product issues, and negligence accounts for negligence issues. And we could speak a little bit more about the specifics. I think we do have some concerns about a separate regime specific to autonomous vehicles that kind of takes out of the context of defects liability, right? We do believe that defects liability can adequately account for that when there is a sort of defect, and negligence when there is a sort of negligence issue. But happy to talk further and work a little bit more on this.
Yeah, I would appreciate that, and would welcome the conversation about how an individual would be able to access the information that they would need to do in order to prove a product liability. So yeah, great. And David, yeah, go ahead and I don't think I have your email, but I will find it and we can go ahead and get a meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Armand.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Representative Kloba. This might be sort of tangential to the topic or potentially related. I am curious, similar to how we've been discussing a law enforcement interaction plan, if there will also be some form of an interaction plan for human drivers, should they be involved in a collision with an autonomous vehicle. What comes to mind is in the future when we have more of these vehicles operating with no safety driver, for example, and a collision were to occur, some clear steps for human drivers to take to, be able to exchange information, do the thing that some of us have experienced before, where you exchange your insurance, you exchange your contact info. I think there might be some lack of clarity for operators of the human vehicles, and I think that will play into the educational piece as well to make sure that we're providing the right information for all road users.
Yeah, and I think that is very common sense as you think through how would that actually happen in the moments after a crash, and once you determine that people are okay, or if they need medical attention they get it, but certainly figuring out in the absence of a driver, how do you get the information that you need? And there's certainly not sure if it would be a part of this bill or could be accomplished through rulemaking or something else. It's a really important thing that you brought up, though, between that and what was the other thing I was just going to say? Anyway, we'll leave it at that. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you, Armand. Armand, have you reached out to the Washington Traffic Safety Commission as well in regards to your question?
I have not, but we are planning to engage with the commission later in December and January on an update on the AV program. So we'll definitely bring that up then.
Thank you. Okay, other questions or comments for Representative Kloba? They're letting you off easy.
All right. Thank you so much for giving me the time on the agenda.
Thank you. All right, moving on. We're early, 30 minutes, but we'll definitely continue moving forward here. So next item on the agenda is the AV roadmap to the future, final walkthrough. And we have Rima Griffith, the Executive Director of Transportation Commission, and Markel Moffett, Transportation Advisory Services from CDM Smith. Ladies, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction and then hand off to Markel, who will be going into the details of the roadmap per the information that we had sent out last Friday on the action items that we'll be asking for you all to ultimately vote on in terms of your support for the notions, as well as getting input on how we might need to adjust them or modify them. So just real quick, we've talked about the roadmap to the future for probably at least a few years now, is kind of basically the work group and the commission's kind of legacy deliverable to the legislature. The idea being that this work group will disband in December, and of course, AV work, research and testing will advance for many years after this. And so we're really challenged with trying to hand something off to the legislature that will have a lifespan that at least sets the stage for those foundational needs and regulatory structures that they should consider, as well as kind of agency readiness and resourcing to make sure that our state is structured and ready for the operation of autonomous vehicles in the future. There are 5 key components, as we've covered in the past, that will serve as building blocks for the roadmap. They include agency readiness, public outreach, safety, testing and pilots, and a path to deployment. And we are also currently considering, and welcome your feedback today, that we are considering adding perhaps a 6th area or component that is specifically dedicated to equity, making sure that we address that more holistically in this final roadmap. Each key area will identify within those 5 or 6 components, will identify future considerations and needs, maybe further evaluation and study that is needed by decision makers as they think about what AV policies and laws and regulations need to be set forth as time marches on after this year. And the roadmap is really designed to offer guidance and give lawmakers really a menu of options and choices that is before them that they will have to make at some point as we prepare for these operations. It is not a regulatory document. It is not setting forth regulatory guidance in any formal manner. It is really designed to be a high-level guidance document for lawmakers to kind of check those boxes off as they incrementally address the needs as we prepare for AVs in our state into the future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rima. So
Yeah.
I am going to switch over to, we are going to be using the tool called Poll Everywhere, which is very similar to the Mentimeter tool that we've used in the past. And what we're going to do is actually walk through each of the feature considerations that were sent out last Friday, one by one, talk through the objectives, the actions, and gauge a level of support and get any reservations, concerns, comments, feedback by individual consideration. So on my screen, you should now be seeing roadmap agency readiness, focusing on permitting. At the very top of the screen, you will see join by web. There is a URL you can type into your mobile or desktop browser, or on your smartphone, you can use that QR code scan in the top right and it'll pull it up for you. And this will be an active polling and feedback exercise. So for each one of these, the first slide will be gauging level of support simply by clicking one of the 3 buttons available on your screen. And then we'll go into more of an open forum feedback for each one. So starting with permitting under the key component agency readiness. So the permitting consideration really has an objective of refining the state's existing permitting and notification program that is currently being run through the DOL self-certification program for AV use on public roadways. And the action is to resource agencies with dedicated staff and resources to holistically manage an AV permitting program, from assessing on-road testing applications and operations, compliance to deployment. Currently is a small-scale program, but we want to make sure that this is developed out to be robust, and determine what other agencies, if any, play a role in that permitting process, and make sure to provide resources and authorization for those agencies to engage as well. So we'll pause here and give folks time to submit just what is your level of support on this permitting feature consideration, its objective and actions listed. Very supportive, somewhat supportive with some reservations, or not supportive. And after we're done with this, we will be able to jump to an open forum feedback on this particular topic. We'll pause for just a minute or two. Lots of responses coming in. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got a lot of feedback, 56% so far very supportive, 31% somewhat with some reservations, and 13% at not supportive. So we'll go ahead and jump to the next question, which is on this permitting consideration. if someone are not supportive, what are your reservations? You can either unmute and we can discuss them verbally, or go ahead and submit and type it in on your browser or your smartphone. We will capture all of these comments and make sure they are incorporated and or otherwise acknowledged in some form or fashion in the roadmap and final report to make sure all perspectives are captured.
Annabelle, did you want to speak? Yes.
Yes, thank you. I think where we have a major concern is understanding kind of where this permitting structure will take place, right? So for example, we don't have a legislative framework for anything beyond testing at this point. It is still just within the testing phase. So there is no future commercial deployment capabilities. And so I think our concern is resourcing a dedicated AV staff, et cetera, for just a testing without deployment feels backwards. There has to be a clear path for companies for commercial deployment. And so that is our larger concern, is that this is kind of taken in a vacuum without the much larger context. And of course, from an experience perspective, our larger concern with the permitting process is that it can be incredibly cumbersome. There are models that work very well and models that are, I would say, take multi-year processes. So just voicing some of our concerns there.
Thank you, Annabelle. Other questions or comments?
All right, let's got some good comments coming in. And I did want to acknowledge that after this meeting today, we will take all this feedback, incorporate into the draft roadmap document, and an actual draft roadmap document for written feedback will be going out about mid-November. So anything not captured today, you will be able to submit written feedback later this month.
Thank you, Markel.
Okay, let's move on to the next consideration under agency readiness. Infrastructure. So the objective of this consideration is really to identify and prioritize infrastructure investment needs to support the efficient and safe AV operations in the near and long term. Several different actions here. One, to prepare an AV strategic plan which identifies those needed investments and the organizational needs to implement those identified actions. Addressing the needs for physical and digital infrastructure investments, as well as funding, resources, and partnerships needed to actually implement the investments recommended. The AV strategic plan should also include the evaluation of equity opportunities and impact and infrastructure needs and improvements, not to forget that equity lens in the conversation, as discussed by Dr. Dannenberg a little bit earlier today. And also to appoint, and we did receive written feedback before this meeting, appoint and resource a state AV lead agency to lead the strategic planning effort, as well as coordinate the activities across various agencies that may play a role in this space. Thank you. We've got a lot of feedback coming in on level of support so far. Give it just another minute or two. All right. Jumping into, if there are any reservations, comments, concerns, feedback, here's your opportunity on the infrastructure consideration to either unmute and discuss or put in writing in this tool. Justin, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I can't turn my camera on. My reservation, I was somewhat supportive of this. My reservation, and probably no surprise to folks on this call that know me, is when we talk about resources, how is this going to be competing with other needs in the state for infrastructure? We are already failing behind our maintenance backlog. Of course, we are failing our needs in mobility for people with special needs and people who don't have working cars. So I just worry a little bit about this as a priority and how this might actually take away from other kind of longstanding needs and backlogs of infrastructure that the state has throughout.
Thank you. Appreciate that comment. We've got some other ones coming in. Coordination by the state AV lead should also include cities and counties to maintain the roads. Absolutely, thank you for that. And concern about spending resources without proper collaboration so that we're not duplicating efforts. Absolutely. Wonderful feedback. Okay. Go ahead and jump to the next consideration under agency readiness, multi-state coordination. So coordinating with neighboring states to ensure common approaches for travel and interstate commerce. And the action guidance here is to create a standing forum for that coordination to occur with representatives from Oregon, Idaho, and or the Washoe area to really ensure that long-term coordination in the space of preparing for safe AV roadway operation in the state. Give folks just another minute to respond. Feel like we should have the Jeopardy timer going. Wonderful. Okay. So on the topic of multi-state coordination under agency readiness, any comments, feedback, concerns, reservations that folks would like to verbally or written submit? Please do so. Give this just a few minutes. Great feedback coming in. Make sure that this is adequately resourced. Again, acknowledging that all of this should be resources is incredibly important in all of these efforts, and to use any existing structures and forums instead of creating something new. Absolutely. Not one more meeting on your calendar if you don't need it. All right. Jumping to agency readiness, agency preparedness through training. So the objective to develop skill sets within state agencies to understand AV industry developments, regulatory requirements, and partnerships by developing training resources for state agencies to support their ability to remain current on these technologies and AV industry advancements, really building that internal knowledge base. So give folks a minute to identify level of support. All right. Jumping in for agency preparedness through training. Any comments, concerns, feedback, reservations? Feedback to agree on a standard before getting involved in any training. Sources of training and where does it come from? That is a great question. Not included in this view, but will be included in the roadmap document are examples of where other jurisdictions or the industry has done this activity at the federal level or national level. So I know for this particular one, the examples include resources that already exist at the national level from various national commissions and organizations that gather these types of training resources so that it's not created new. So that kind of information will be included in the document. Great question about funding. Who's paying for this? That is a great question. We will make sure to acknowledge the need to be able to fund this, both from a time and resource perspective. And again, acknowledgement to coordinate with city and county staff, absolutely. Great feedback. All right, jumping to the next, this is a very long one. Agency readiness, infrastructure planning, and safety. So as infrastructure investments that we talked about a few considerations ago continue to be made, begin to consider the needs of AVs and other emerging technologies and how that impacts planning and safety. So complementary investments that not only support AV accommodations, but also increase the safety and for the general motoring public for all road users today and in the future. Examples of those enhancements that could be made now for current road user safety as well as AV preparedness includes updating pavement markings with consistent and clear markings or reflectivity that is helpful for drivers now and can be helpful as AVs start to test and deploy on the roadways and help them traverse appropriately. And also managing curb space, acknowledging back to the Open Mobility Foundation presentation earlier, being able to acknowledge that and collect the data and really understand and manage that mobility piece of the infrastructure that helps protect road user safety now and can also assist with AV testing and operation. So give folks a minute to acknowledge level of support for this item. All right, and on this particular item, any comments, concerns, feedback, reservations? Now, this is a pretty meaty one. Give folks a few minutes to type. AV legislation should not preempt cities from being able to manage curb space for AV loading and other purposes. Very much appreciate that feedback. Need support safety for all. Absolutely. Great, lots of feedback coming in. Acknowledgement that transportation investment cycles can be very long cycles, even longer than traditional IT investments. Absolutely. This is great feedback. Give folks another minute. Looks like there's a lot of feedback on this one, so we'll give this a little bit longer. Folks are typing. All right, moving ahead. Agency readiness and consideration for partnerships to develop and further cultivate partnerships with the private sector for strategic AV testing and investment in the states. An action to create and resource a state level office focused on developing strategic private sector partnerships within the AV and technology space to support the advancement of a methodical process of preparation for AVs. That cultivation should include identifying opportunities to address a variety of AV impacts, basically all of the things that we're talking about today and all of the other items within the roadmap, and how partnerships can help move some of those considerations forward, such as workforce, infrastructure, equity, and safety. So we've got a lot that are somewhat supportive, but do have some reservations. That number keeps ticking up. Okay. Give this just another minute. Okay. So many folks flagged somewhat supportive, but with reservations. So excited to see the flurry of comments, feedback, and reservations that hopefully come in on this particular item of partnerships. Acknowledgement that there is already a WSDOT Office of Public-Private Partnerships. Potential for waiting until a regulatory certainty at the state. For commercial, I assume that's for commercial deployments. Clear authority and governance for these partnerships is important. See a lot of acknowledgement that maybe not a specific state level office is needed, rather than leveraging existing programs and resources. Another acknowledgement to make sure to include that local lens. Not everything happens at a state level, but happens at a local level. Appreciate that. Okay, lots of great feedback. Some concerns about taking investment away from other needed areas. So appreciate that feedback. Okay, jumping ahead. Moving on to the public outreach component, starting with the consideration for public education, providing public education and outreach to advance the understanding around the benefits and limitations of AV technologies, to encourage safe and effective deployment, assigning and resourcing a lead agency, and authorize and resource them to develop a public AV outreach plan that could include statewide focus groups, surveys, etc. Should also include an equity strategy that identifies the approaches and processes for engaging underrepresented communities. We'll give folks a few moments to acknowledge level of support on this item. All right. On the topic of public outreach, comments, concerns, feedback, reservations. I really appreciate everyone hanging in. I know this is a little more of a lull in the conversation today, not quite as lively, but I really appreciate all of the feedback. And it's incredibly helpful for assisting the Transportation Commission in developing this roadmap to provide guidance to decision makers. Wonderful. Lots of great input. Thank you.
Great input. I appreciate the public education as a state responsibility. I also like seeing all the ADAS stuff because it's important that we educate the public on ADAS.
Absolutely. All right. Moving forward, under public outreach, consideration for collaboration with partner states, peer agencies, and technology developers to identify best practices and identify consensus approach to managing that operation. Engaging in dialogues with industry organizations, representatives through working groups, conference attendance, conversations, etc., as well as other states and jurisdictions, AV representatives to stay informed on what's happening around the country and what Washington can do and potentially leverage as it works to prepare for this. So really helping inform what kind of outreach, engagement, collaboration, knowledge development can be done to continue the conversation. Okay, it looks like it's slowed down a bit. We'll go ahead and move on the topic of collaboration, comments, concerns, feedback, reservations. Yeah, acknowledgement to add members of the public and their voice to collaboration. Absolutely. Make sure that their voices are heard. Okay, lots of great feedback about expanding the realm of collaboration to make sure that it's covering all those perspectives, not just industry and agencies, but also acknowledging partner states, cities, the public, all great feedback. Wonderful. All right. Moving to topic of safety. First up is law enforcement and first responders, ensuring that AV companies understand law enforcement and first responder needs before deploying, and ensuring that the law enforcement and first responders understand how to interact with those AVs. So we've talked a lot about that with the law enforcement interaction plan or guide that engages with law enforcement and first responders in each jurisdiction, and or essentially provided at the state level with state agencies disseminating to those localities in a more centralized fashion. That's 30 seconds or so. Okay. On the topic of law enforcement and first responders, comments, concerns, feedback, reservations. Okay, starting to get some great feedback. Drones require engagement with police and fire staff to understand the real challenges with AV interactions and their needs. Also going with the second comment of listening to those on the ground will add a needed practical perspective. Absolutely. Safety is the first priority. Learning from other states and local jurisdictions like Seattle to actively engage in the space. Wonderful. Look to adopt similar approaches that have worked well elsewhere. Wonderful. All right, great feedback. We're over halfway there, folks. Hang with me. So under the topic of safety, AV incident reporting and analysis. So monitoring the AV testing and deployment activities to enable the informed regulatory decision-making and advancement of public safety. Actions to develop requirements and a framework for incident reporting and incident analysis at the state level, starting with what is currently already being collected by NHTSA and determining whether state level reporting is further needed to supplement the information provided by or to NHTSA by AV companies. Using that incident reporting information to develop and shape minimal risk and liability profiles, liability requirements, for various deployment scenarios. For example, a low-speed fixed route AV shuttle that operates on a private campus will likely have a very different risk profile and potentially different liability requirements than an AV that operates freely at various speeds across multiple public roadway types, such as a city street, a rural road, or a state highway. And an action to determine any potential legal, operational, and/or financial penalties to assess an AV company operating in Washington if one of its AVs is responsible for the cause of a safety incident. Give about 30 more seconds. All right. AV incident reporting and analysis, comments, feedback, concerns, reservations. David.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Thanks for this. I would just add that I appreciate the comment about starting with what's already required by NHTSA and collecting information in that context. I would just note that to the extent that that is also collected by the state, and we've seen this before, just making sure that it's collected with the same cadence, under the same definitions, under the same sort of approach, because otherwise you can risk confusion about how it's collected at different times that it's collected. So again, I appreciate the comment, and just to ensure that sort of consistency and uniformity is important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good information. Armand.
Thanks, Chair. And sort of in concurrence with David, I think in order to avoid duplicative reporting, to be clear about which reports go to which agencies, but also be transparent about the timeline in which those reports get transmitted to relevant agencies. For example, if something is under NHTSA's purview, that's fine. But if a city or the state doesn't find out about it until months later, either through an annual report or some other mechanism, that can impede decision-making as it comes to managing the right-of-way.
Wonderful feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Armand. Other questions, comments?
All right. Vulnerable road user safety. So setting expectations and requirements for AV operational performance and ensure that there's a clear understanding of AV operations by all road users, including conducting any public outreach on AV testing, pilot, or deployment, identify road safety related information such as signage that will require improvements to clearly communicate the presence of AVs and expectations of how road users may interact with an AV. In the document that was sent out last Friday, I think this includes a couple of examples, I believe from a Utah AV shuttle pilot of clear roadway signage that acknowledges for vulnerable road users that there's an AV in the area, that this is a crossing that may interact with an AV path, and clearance recommendations like staying 5 feet away from an AV unless onboarding. So those are some examples of that road signage acknowledged. Took about a minute here. Okay, seems to have slowed down, so we'll go ahead and move forward. On the topic of vulnerable road user safety, these consideration, objectives, and actions, comments, concerns, feedback, reservations. Okay, acknowledgement of where the funding is going to come from. Counties and states be responsive to vulnerable populations by collaborating on geofencing or operational design domains for AV deployments as necessary. And acknowledgement that road signage may not be a practical solution. It may not be the only part of the solution, at least. Okay. Moving on to data and cybersecurity under the safety key component. So safeguards the security and privacy of data and communications related to AVs, especially in safety critical situations, investing resources to execute or support initiatives that focus on data management, data security, data privacy, and cybersecurity, including network security for remote operations and policies related to personally identifiable information. Direct agencies executing or supporting these initiatives to leverage industry best practices and fill in gaps as needed for data privacy and data sharing standards for any data collected by or shared with the state. And I know that the I think it's Data Security and System Technology Subcommittee, I think is the title. One of the 7 subcommittees of this work group did a lot of work in this space over the past 5 years to acknowledge where areas may be specific to the AV space and where existing industry best practices and standards already exist, regardless of whether it's an AV for data privacy, security, management. So there's definitely been a lot of considerations in this space to date.
The poll does not seem to be responding.
Oh. Under. Let me try reloading it. Okay, looks like it clicked back on. Looks a minute, now it's back up. Okay, on the topic of data and cybersecurity, comments, concerns, feedback, reservations. And Ariel, I see your comment in the chat of who this potential cyber and data security action would be directed towards. That is really up to the legislatures to consider which agencies, but I would assume that multiple agencies, basically any agency that is interacting with this security and privacy of data and communications related to AVs would have some sort of part in this conversation and action.
Thanks.
Okay, lots of great feedback on this topic. Another minute as more comments are coming in. Okay, it looks to have flowed, so we'll go ahead and move forward. Jumping into the key area of testing and pilots now, with the consideration for pilots, with the objective of providing the public firsthand experience with AVs, enabling the exploration of possible operational considerations unique to Washington in preparation for future AV deployments, and identifying approaches to harness AV opportunities that increase equity and access. With an action that pairs very nicely with the recommendation from last year to carry out a state-sponsored pilot, conducting that state-sponsored and managed AV pilot in multiple locations statewide, as well as the potential to create a state-led grant program to encourage local municipalities and/or companies to manage their own AV projects, integrating public engagement as a core component of any pilot. So about a minute for folks to respond. All right. On the topic of pilots, comments, concerns, feedback, reservation. Justin.
Yeah, and to my earlier comment, I can't in good conscience support something that says we would recommend a grant program not knowing how that is going to be funded. Knowing what I know and playing in the transportation revenue and expenses world for what I do for the association, it is mostly robbing Peter to pay Paul at this point. So no way could we support that without knowing firsthand how are we funding that, and frankly all of these other recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Okay, give folks another minute or so to provide feedback. Okay. Also in the key area of testing and pilots is AV testing lessons learned. So documenting learnings from testing activities in state to inform policymaking and future AV development, deployment, as well as staying informed of lessons learned from other jurisdictions, testing and pilot activities to further inform decision makers. This action specifically requests to direct the State Transportation Commission to develop a lessons learned inventory from other jurisdictions' AV testing efforts and activities, as well as directing state agencies responsible for leading any AV pilots in Washington or monitoring AV testing activities to document and share those lessons learned with peer agencies, lawmakers, and other states, building on AV lessons learned around the country. So Annabelle, I see you've got a question in the chat on a time check to be able to wrap up on time. So this meeting should be scheduled until 1 p.m. Pacific. So we are actually got about an hour and 5 minutes left of the meeting total. And Jim, I think you may have the agenda in front of you. I think this agenda item was originally supposed to go to 12:40.
Correct. Yeah, the annual report goes to 12:40, and then final work group meeting wrap up and next steps, me and Rima at 12:50.
Okay. Okay. AV testing lessons learned, comments, concerns, reservations, feedback. Okay, well, moving on to the key area of path to deployment. And the first topic up for discussion is defining a clear path to deployment, providing clear expectations of regulatory agencies, supporting entities, and companies deploying AVs in Washington. Assigning and resourcing a lead state agency to coordinate across decision makers, peer agencies, community partners, and the AV industry partners to define what a clear path to deployment means in Washington state. In leveraging other states' AV policies to align where applicable to reduce a patchwork of policy across the country. About 30 more seconds for a response to this one. Okay. On the topic of defining a clear path to deployment, any feedback, reservations, comments, concerns? We're in the home stretch, folks. 2 more topics after this. Give about another minute in this one. Lots of great feedback. About 30 more seconds. All right, on to the next topic. Monitoring and addressing changes at the federal level. So monitoring AV policy activity happening at federal level and take action as needed when AV policies shift nationally. Assigning and resourcing a state agency to monitor that activity happening at the federal level for AV policy regulation and operational approaches, and directing that lead agency to keep apprised of and communicate with decision makers and peer agencies those federal shifts in AV policies and approach in case any state level action may be needed. Give about a minute for folks to respond to this. Okay, on the topic of monitoring and addressing changes at the federal level, comments, concerns, feedback, reservations. Okay, lots of great feedback coming in. We'll give about 30 more seconds. All right, and the last topic to discuss today under path to deployment is local regulation, with an objective to actively collaborate with and support local level AV policy, regulation, and testing and deployment activities. At the state level, assigning a resourcing a lead agency to maintain that ongoing coordination and collaboration with cities of Washington, to act in concert with cities, conducting AV research, policy making, and or testing and deployments. Coordination would include identifying consistent approaches across cities where applicable, coordinating public communication and messaging, leveraging lessons learned from other localities, et cetera, to have a local focus with a statewide approach where, you know, cities don't have to start from scratch and they can all learn from each other, and both the state and cities can have consistent approaches to testing and deployment of AVs in the state of Washington. About 30 more seconds for folks to respond. All right. And on the topic of local regulation, comments, concerns, feedback, reservations.
Yes, Ariel.
And just briefly, I know we've talked about it in previous meetings, but I'll just reiterate the point that I think it's difficult to envision broad-based deployment in a safe way and in a consistent way if there's local regulation that is put in place. And there would also be a departure from other constructs that we've seen. So just caution against this, figure, say it out loud. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron.
Armand.
Yes, Armand, sorry.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that I think that the conversation can be nuanced in how cities can be involved. For example, the example I like to push towards is our management of other shared mobility like scooter, bike, and car share. We have more than 4 private vendors who all compete with each other to provide services in Seattle, and we're able to manage them effectively using open data standards like what was presented earlier, to make sure that there's a consistent approach for operators and that we're also getting the data, only the data that we need just to manage the right of way. So I think there are mechanisms in place for there to be local regulation for things like curb loading, system management, roadway management, et cetera, while still having a set of baseline rules for the state to allow for a clear path for deployment that avoids the patchwork to allow the companies to bring their services to multiple cities.
Thank you, Armand. Yes, Ariel.
And just a very quick follow-up. I appreciate the comments, and I would very much embrace the idea, and I think we're aligned, that engagement with cities and localities is of the utmost importance. And so I think this is really just a question of the regulation word, as opposed to collaboration and working in advance and all the things that go with that kind of partnership with cities. So I just want to make sure it's my comment was confined solely to the concept of regulation, which I think that becomes difficult to have that patchwork that Armand referenced. So I appreciate his comments and in the spirit of collaboration going forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was the last of the topics to discuss on this agenda item. So Jim, do we want to open it up for any final comments, thoughts, concerns, questions?
Yes, please. Anyone who has questions or comments on anything that was presented here, please. Yes, Justin.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little lost still on going back to the funding. It would have been nice to see a recommendation of a state agency to start identifying how other states are funding these type of plans. We're recommending a large staff up for agencies, identifying an agency to do a public outreach plan and resource it. How are other states funding this? Is it through permits on the AV companies that are they're charging fees that way? Is it taking from current funding sources? And I think it's really incumbent upon us to also look at this. We just asked for a lot to be recommended on the expense side of it, but where are the deposits coming from, right? So, and I think within a scarce resource system, you're going to start getting a lot of people saying, get out of my sandbox. You're not funding this with my resources. So just a food for thought on that topic. I was kind of waiting for that topic to come up, and it never did.
Thank you, Justin. Questions or comments on Justin's comment? Any other questions or comments on this item? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Markel. Appreciate your presentation. Rima, you ready to join me?
Jim, I think we've got one more quick agenda item for myself.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
To talk through very briefly, just an overview of the annual report. So not only at the end of this year will the roadmap legacy deliverable be delivered to the governor and legislature, but the final annual report for 2023. So we just want to talk through that very quickly to give folks an idea of what will be in there.
Gotcha.
So an acknowledgement that every year the work group and the Transportation Commission is legislatively required to submit an annual report on the progress of the work group, and acknowledging that for this particular report, it is the last report. So it will not only address what happens during 2023, but for the work group in a whole. So we saw this earlier in today's meeting, acknowledgement of all of the work, effort, and accomplishments that this work group has completed in its purview, as well as anything that happened specifically this year, acknowledgement of prior recommendations, their status, all of the work, the education, the engagement that's happened since June 2018. It will also discuss any final report outs from the subcommittees that we heard today, and acknowledge the refinement and finalization of the roadmap, which has its own chapter a little later. It will acknowledge the recommendation of the roadmap to the future legacy deliverable as a recommendation from the Transportation Commission with great feedback and input from the work group, as well as acknowledging previous year's recommendations to consider further action. I believe we talked about this at the end of last year, the last work group meeting last year, bringing back recommendations that have been previously endorsed by both the work group and Transportation Commission that had not been moved forward for further action from there. So an acknowledgement of that again. And then a summary of the roadmap to the future, which will be its own separate deliverable, but the annual report will acknowledge the work that has been done to date and the wrap up of getting that roadmap deliverable prepared for presentation to the governor and legislature. And just a conclusion to acknowledge that the work group sunsets December 31st of this year. The roadmap legacy deliverable really sets the stage for next steps after this work group sunsets, and an encouragement to continue that active collaboration and communication and exploration of AVs, both in state and nationally. So just a quick preview of what the annual report will look like. I don't know if anyone has any comments, questions.
Questions on the annual report? Not seeing any.
All right. On to you and Rima.
Thank you so much, Markel. Okay, Rima, why don't you go ahead and start?
Oh, well, I just, want to just kind of say thanks to, of course, everyone, but special thank you to all the state agencies and staff who really came to the table with no resources from day one of this effort. And that was kind of one of the big question marks of this process was, will we be able to have an inclusive, collaborative, comprehensive discussion with all these state agencies that this topic touches, and without helping them have those resources. And it was refreshing and very much appreciated to see the leadership of every agency say, yeah, this is important. Yes, we want our staff at the table. And to actively participate for 5 years is just frankly remarkable. So I want to thank everyone who rolled their sleeves up to kind of help in the behind the scenes really carry this forward, because the commission really could not have done this without that support and input. And then also just to the work group executive committee members, your time and commitment to this has been appreciated. And while there's been robust and lively debate, I think it's really helped everybody hopefully gain some perspective on everyone's positions, and hopefully will be and has been informative for lawmakers as they think about how they want to move forward. So thanks again, Jim. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Rima. I appreciate it. First, I want to thank my vice chair, Commissioner Shiv Batra, for working with us over the last 5 years, as well as the committee staff for their support, or the commission staff for your support. Rima, you and your staff have been outstanding supporting this work group, and I appreciate that. I'd also like to call attention to our contractors, Scott Shogun, Senior Vice President of WSP, and Markel Moffett with CDM Smith. You guys knocked it out of the park. You really provided the information we needed in a timely manner, and I appreciate that. I want to thank the co-chairs of all the subcommittees, to my fellow committee members for their participation, input, and guidance. And lastly, I'd like to publicly thank former State Representative Zach Hutchins for authoring the work group's enabling legislation. It was your foresight that gave us the ability to work, so I appreciate that. It's been my honor to serve as your chair, and I look forward to working with all of you in the future in my role on the State Transportation Commission. I know of no other business to come before this august body, and without objection, I will adjourn this final meeting of the Washington State Autonomous Vehicle Work Group. Thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.